All right, welcome everybody. So this this is a topic that's really near and dear to our hearts here at OpsLevel. You might call it production readiness or application maturity or service maturity or operational excellence. We've heard so many different names, and often companies have internal names for these things, but the name isn't really important. What we're talking about today is fundamentally how to build good services or good applications or good systems or systems that will meet your needs in terms of reliability, security, quality. And we'll go into what all that means. Now, the title is a bit clickbaity here, but what we're going to discuss today is how to implement production readiness at your organization and how to make it successful. So yeah, let's dive in. The actual topics we're going to cover. First, we'll do a quick overview of what is production readiness, why you should care about it, and then we'll dig into the main challenges of actually implementing it. We'll go over these in the talk, but we'll go over the discovery problems, measurement problems, and cultural problems, and then how to solve those challenges. We'll spend a lot of our time on that. Before we dive in, we'll just cover a little bit about myself and Ken, my co-founder here, who's going to be co-presenting. So I'm John. I'm CEO and co-founder here at OpsLevel. In terms of myself, a little bit about my history. I started my career at Amazon. This was back in the mid 2000s, and it was one of the earliest microservices architectures there at Amazon, as well as one of the earliest DevOps, you build it, you own it type cultures at Amazon. Now this is before both those terms, microservices and DevOps, even existed. But Amazon, they both had these early types of microservices architectures, but they also cared quite a bit about production readiness and the concept of production readiness. Although at the time it was largely through manual processes like architectural reviews, before launching a new service, or seasonal Black Friday type preparations, but they did a lot of investment in those two areas. After Amazon, I joined this company, PagerDuty, as their first employee. And I was there for a long time, and we did a ton to help companies adopt DevOps, improve reliability, but it was always in a very reactive way, right? Like a service is broken, I need a person to go fix it right now. Let's go page somebody. And what we found is that many companies wanted to be more proactive in how they approach reliability and how they approach security. And so that's why we founded OpsLevel, me and my co-founder, Ken. So Ken, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
For sure. Thanks, John. So yeah, as John pointed out, John was the first employee of PagerDuty. I was their first Canadian employee when they set up their Canadian office back in 2013. And John and I worked together for years, and I went on a very similar journey of helping engineering organizations kind of better adopt DevOps, but in a very reactive fashion. I also spent a couple of years at Shopify. John touched on some of the Black Friday prep that they did at Amazon. Shopify also was a very large e-commerce retailer, went through a significant amount of preparation for what they call BFCM, their Black Friday, Cyber Monday work. And I'm going to be talking about that later in the presentation. So this idea of production readiness and how to improve how organizations manage production readiness is something that's very near and dear to my heart as well.
All right, awesome. So let's get into production readiness. And first we'll speak to why you should care about production readiness in the first place. So the first question is what is production readiness? Production readiness is simply the answer to the question, do your production services meet your operating standards? So did they meet your standards that you've established in terms of all these ilities, reliability, observability, security, quality, maintainability, all these things that you define that as what's important to how you build your services, and are your services meeting those standards? So why is that important? Well, there's no such thing as perfect software, and we all know this. Things will break, but the goal is to minimize that breakage by removing the most highly occurring preventable causes. And these preventable errors, these preventable outages or preventable downtime, these are usually caused by things that we've painfully learned lessons from in the past. We've all experienced outages and incidents in the past. If you have an incident management process, you might do postmortems and learn lessons from these outages and improve your services, right? But these improvements, they might be local to a specific team, and they don't always make it across to other teams, in the company. But you might still experience these issues again elsewhere, and this could usually lead to things like fire drills with more incidents, a lot of rework, Lost downtime can lead to lost money and even lost reputation. Of course, it reduces your developer velocity and can impact your engineering morale overall, right? So like overall, what does that impact your business? It's you're burning money, you're burning time, and all of this loss is really preventable. And production readiness is really how to prevent a lot of these issues. So, what's hard about implementing production readiness? Well, there are three main challenges that we're going to go over today. So we're going to talk about the discovery problem, measurement problem, and the cultural problem. In terms of the discovery problem, the definition is you have a lot of services, you have a lot of systems. The first step is really just cataloging and understanding what exists out there. You can't improve what you don't even know exists. The second problem is a measurement problem. You have to determine what your production readiness model will be and then how to actually evaluate it. What properties or what metrics do you want to look at? Because you can't improve what you can't measure, right? And then the last problem is more of a cultural problem. It's like a people problem, and it's one of the hardest problems. You can do all this work to set up what it means to be production ready, but if no one at your organization cares about it or has any time to implement it, it doesn't get done, right? So you have to solve all these problems. Let's go through each one of these and talk about how to solve these. So first we'll cover like how to solve that discovery problem. It's just understanding, before you can get your services and systems production ready, there's this overall prerequisite that you need. That seems obvious once you think about it. You need to know what services are actually out there. So the way that you can solve that, the way that we recommend solving that is through an automated service catalog. It's a foundation needed to get there. And what it means is you need to know what exists, and more importantly, actually you need to know who owns it and who's responsible for it. And you need to be very clear to developers on what they're responsible for in this kind of you build it, you own it, or having solid ownership around all of your services. And we recommend making it simple, just making clear what services do you own and what does ownership actually mean. And in terms of creating that catalog, we don't recommend doing something like this to your teams, whether it's a spreadsheet or a Notion page or a Confluence page. We've seen all these early iterations of this. Don't make them build it all by hand. It'll quickly get out of date, and it'll quickly won't be that complete picture. So your catalog will never be complete and up to date unless it's automated rather than a manual process. So the question is, okay, what does it mean? Like, what does an automated catalog look like? I'll give you a quick demo of some parts of OpsLevel that show like what that could look like in terms of an automated catalog. Let me just share my screen. All right, you can see that. Okay. All right, perfect. So this is an example catalog within OpsLevel. So this is, as a service owner, my dashboard, just understanding and seeing what services my team owns, what repos my team owns and are responsible for, and just getting that overall view really quickly. The full catalog you can see here under the services tab. This is a view of like all the services within my organization and all the metadata around my services. Now the question is like, where does a lot of this data come from? We can integrate with all sorts of your systems depending on what you use. If you are using Kubernetes, for instance, we have a plugin that can automatically try to infer services from Kubernetes. We also plug into a number of different sources and can infer services and information from those sources. So you can plug in all of your deployments and push them all to OpsLevel. You can plug in a lot of your maturity signals, and we'll talk about those a little bit later in our talk today. But you might be plugging in something like Sneak and pushing vulnerabilities to us, and so we'll start noticing things that we don't know about and start automatically making suggestions to keep creating and updating that catalog as we get these signals. Overall, you can build out a catalog that's full and complete. I'll show you what like a specific service might look like here and some of the metadata that we track. Through integrations with Git, you can find where do you find the code for your service, all that same high level metadata around your service. We can help you track where do you find your service in its tool chain, like where do you find the errors or the metrics dashboard, or where's, where are my logs? And of course, we help you track deployments. You can see what changes are being made. You can see, are there open incidents or issues in my service right now? It's upstream and downstream dependencies, and even how do I program against these services, maybe like for other services out there through API documentation. So, through all of this, you can get a good picture of what services exist. Let me go back to the main presentation. And once your catalog is in place, the next step is to figure out how to implement and structure and scale that production readiness so developers will engage with it. So let's talk about solving the maturity problem. Next, Ken, I'll pass it to you.
Awesome. Thanks, John. So yeah, as John pointed out, right, the first step is really like automating the catalog and solving the discovery problem. Here, now we're going to get into like the measurement problem. Like, how do we actually do production readiness? John, you want to go to the next slide? So a starting point that a lot of people begin with is this. They start with an actual checklist of all of the things that they care about that's going on in their production infrastructure. And this is actually a fine starting place, but it's akin to managing your service catalog in a spreadsheet. It's a decent starting place, but it's not going to be able to scale. You will have challenges with scaling this to your entire engineering organization. Next slide. So the two big classes of challenges are, the first is this data collection challenge. If I look at some of the things that are actually in this checklist, it's a lot of effort to be able to manually fill this in, right? Being able to determine if I as a human have to fill in like our backup setup, is the data encrypted at rest and in transit? Are we on the latest version of pick whatever favorite framework your services are using? That's a lot of effort, and that will be inconsistent between teams. If I have multiple services that are going to production over the year, there are going to be different answers that people might put because humans are fallible. The second challenge is this evaluation challenge. Like, when you actually evaluate this checklist, like, okay, before a service goes into production, that makes sense. But what happens like a year from now when possibly some new checks have been added onto your production readiness checklist? How do you go back and reevaluate the services that are already in prod? Similarly, what happens when those services change? Maybe the service did pass some check that was on your production readiness checklist, and then over the course of the year, some change happened in the service that now caused it to fail. How do you actually know if the services you have running in your production infrastructure are still compliant? So the way to get to that is automation, right? You want to focus on automation. You don't want to be just having humans checking boxes, right? Automation is actually, it's the reasons infrastructure as code has become popular. It's the similar reasons for why you should automate your catalog. For production readiness, the goal should be declaratively storing your checks and having them be automatically evaluated. So I'll give you an example of that next. Go ahead, John, to the next one. There you go. So being able to, integrate the detection or the measurement that you care about and looking at your source of truth. So here we have an example of a Ruby version check. We want to make sure that the Ruby version is greater than 3.0. And you can see here it says Ruby repo file.ruby version does not satisfy this version constraint. So the goal is to not ask a human to manually enter, are you on the latest version of Ruby, possibly incorrectly. You're actually wanting to be looking at your code or your monitoring systems or your production infrastructure. You want to be looking at the sources of truth. You want to be looking at those as your sources of truth for production readiness so that you can automate the collection of a lot of this data. Next slide, John. Now, once you've started to do that, once you have this automated collection, you now move into this world where you can get into continuous evaluation of your production readiness model. So you're no longer having to worry about, oh, do I only evaluate this before services go into prod? What you want to get into is this mechanism of steady burn, not high intensity. What I mean by that is a high intensity activity to go through your entire production readiness checklist before a service goes out into production. It's a high intensity activity to go through production readiness activities, let's say seasonally. In a past life, I'd mentioned I was at Shopify. There was a significant amount of preparation that would go into Black Friday, Cyber Monday readiness, right? BFCM readiness. That event occurs in November, and generally 4 to 6 months before would be a massive effort across the entire company. There was meetings and coordination to do load testing and quality testing and regression testing of all the various systems. That is a ton of intensity. You're much better served by having this steady burn, constant evaluation that's just much lower friction and yields a higher likelihood of success of your production readiness model. Keep chipping away, keep continuously proving production readiness as opposed to having to sort of like stop the world and have massive engineering investments to get things over the line. Now, another consideration is as you think about like production readiness checklists is like this idea of how do you roll out a new check? And what we advocate for at OpsLevel is taking this sort of graduated approach to that. So I'll work this through an example. If you think about what a flat checklist looks like, you can imagine I have a checklist like this, and this one has 12 checks on it, 4 are failing, 8 are passing. So I have 8 out of 12, and it's 66%. And it's like, is that good or bad? 66%. Like, how do I actually compare two different services here? If I have service A at 66 and service B at 72, and what happens if I roll out a new check? Imagine that I have something that's really critical, really important, and this service, let's say, is not doing it. So instead of 8 out of 12, it's now 8 out of 13. Like, have things gotten sort of any better or worse? I have no great insight into like how to compare services or the priority of new checks that are being evaluated on this checklist. All I have is this kind of one single flat number. So in contrast, a different way of structuring your checklist is not as this one massive flat list, but instead is a sort of like graduated levels. So John, if you want to go to the next slide. So this is what we advocate for with OpsLevel, is actually partitioning your checklist into essentially multiple checklists and having this idea of production levels or grades that you can assign to a service. So in this example, we partitioned it across kind of 3 different categories of bronze, silver, and gold. So we have some checks that are bronze, some checks that are considered silver level, and some checks that are considered gold level. And in this case, the overall grade of a service is bronze because it's satisfying all of the checks in that bronze category. Now, we've picked on bronze, silver, gold. You can use whatever naming scheme you want. You can use letter grades like A, B, C, F. You can use the stages of human development like baby, child, teenager, and adult. But a benefit of this approach is that you no longer have all of this context reduced down to a single number. It's actually very easy to compare different services to each other because they just have a single sort of stamped grade that goes on top of them. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the benefits of this graduated leveling approach versus just the flat checklist. Right. So the first one is this idea of prioritization. Prioritization is sort of built in with this system, right? Because there's this logical graduation from one level to the next. You have a prioritization of tasks. You can ensure that sort of those mission critical or foundational checks get run before you go and take on maybe should have or nice to have type work. This is really the idea of like walking before you run. The second, again, is it's easily comparable, right? I'm not having to compare 2 different numbers like 68 and 72%, right? That's the idea of missing or hiding key info, where you're reducing all of this context into a single number. When you have a graduated approach, what you're able to do is just easily compare and knowing where you stand. If I have a service that's bronze and a service that's silver, I know which one is kind of further along or higher. And a final point is that it's somewhat easier to get started when you have this idea of graduated leveling. So I want you to imagine if you just had flat checklists, if you have a service that's at 10%, the end state feels like it has to be 100%. And that's just a long way. There's not a lot of clarity again on what to do next or how do I most meaningfully improve? What is the highest priority activity I can be working on? But if you have a bronze level service, it's a little bit easier because the only things that a service owner has to focus on are just the next services that are necessary to get to that next level of silver. So it allows teams to prioritize and sort of go one step at a time. Go to the next slide. Yeah, thanks, John. So if you have a kind of long flat checklist and you want to move to this graduated model, recognize this is actually a prioritization exercise. It doesn't have to be a hard prioritization exercise, but it is forcing some scrutiny on the checks that you have on your checklist to determine which ones are the actual must-haves and which ones are sort of higher level should have nice-to-haves. One heuristic for doing this is actually pointing out that the things on your lowest level, whether you call that bronze or beginner or baby, should be those must-have checks. So they should be the things that you look at and say, if this is not done, we want to tell teams, stop what you're doing and fix this right now. They should be the things that are either incredibly straightforward for teams to achieve or areas that are highlighting gigantic, technical risk. So some examples here would be for base level checks are like, do all of your services have an owner? Do all of your services have a README that's up to date? Do you have the basic observability in place? And the final thing here is, take your decisions in small pieces, right? Again, walk before you run. You wouldn't implement canary deploys before you had some notion of rollback in your CD systems. You wouldn't implement game days before you had basic observability set up. So think about how you want to sequence the check, break things up into small pieces. It's similar to product development. Walk before you run, have small incremental pieces that teams can take on, and think about how you sequence those checks so you can roll out your production readiness model over time. A lot of organizations can fall into this trap of they have this big end state, they have this massive list, and everybody thinks everything's important and everything's a must-have. And that's not a great approach because you're then actually not prioritizing anything. You have to apply some scrutiny, break up those larger checks into smaller ones, and really focus on the true must-haves and placing those into a lower level. So, what would this look like? Like if we could have software that does this, like how could we get like a continuous and automated and graduated approach to production readiness? I'm going to turn it back to John, who can show a little bit of our rubrics functionality and ops level to do that.
No problem. All right, let me show you ops level. Nope, sorry. Wrong button. There we go. Looks seeing my screen. Cool. So this is ops level. This is our service maturity rubric. This is where you define what's important for all of your services. You see at the top here, we've got levels. Again, Ken mentioned that these are very customizable, but you can start with these levels: bronze, silver, gold. On the left are different categories that are important to you folks, whether it's security, reliability, scalability, observability. And again, these are very customizable as well. Now within them are all those checks, and you can build up on these, as Ken mentioned, in a graduated way, building on more and more important checks. Each of these checks can be looking at different aspects of your services, whether it's some of the metadata around your services, whether it's introspecting into the code, or integrating with many of your other systems to get like that full picture. But it gives you that graduated approach. And another kind of important aspect of this that I wanted to show is the fact that you don't have to apply it to all of your services, but you can scope it down, scope each of these checks down to a subset of your services where it makes the most sense. Like you wouldn't want that Ruby version check to apply to non-Ruby services, right? So being able to build filters. I'll show you what this would look like. Well, let's show you that filter. So you can define these filters on whatever properties make sense. But let me show you what that would look like, as a service owner, when you have this one particular service, and being able to see how it's doing against that rubric. So this is the maturity report on that shopping cart service, on that specific service. And this is showing that this service right now is bronze because it's passing all of the bronze checks, but it's not yet passing all of the silver checks. Here's all those bronze checks, and they're all passing. And so the service is bronze. But yeah, it's showing you here, okay, if you want to get to silver, this is what you need to do. This is the main thing left to get to silver. This is that particular like Ruby version check that we've been talking about. And once that's done, then the service owner will be presented, hey, if you want to get to gold, here's all that other stuff. But don't bother with these things until you get to the point where you do this, because this is a lot more important than the rest. And it's given that explicit prioritization. At the same time, you can see how the service is doing, against all these different categories, because each of these checks are aligned with some specific category. This particular one is a security check, and so this service is still, lagging behind in security, whereas it's doing better reliability, scalability, observability. So yeah, that's that full picture here for this particular service. If you like, though, if you want to see that broader picture, say you're not a service owner, but more so someone in charge of security or reliability, or just someone within leadership in engineering in general, you can get that overall view across all services within your organization through our reporting functionality. So you can see, of all of our services, how are we doing over the overall level, and then broken down by these different categories, how are we doing? And so, overall, we're falling behind more so on security than on these other dimensions. And then you can slice and dice and dig into why, or see how it's broken down, team per team, how things are going, and getting that full picture. So let me pop back to the main presentation. All right, so you've got your catalog in place. You have a way now of measuring production readiness across all your services. The big question is, like, how do you how do you actually roll it out and make it successful at your organization? Like, how do you solve that people problem? So let's dive into that. Step one, it starts at the top, and this is a hard prerequisite. You really need buy-in from the highest levels of the company that all of this production readiness work, like all of this, everything you're asking your developers to do here is actually important. This cultural change, it really needs this strong leadership alignment to work. So that is step one. From there, the next part involves prioritization, and it really involves some really hard decisions that should involve senior stakeholders from both your product teams as well as subject matter experts in various areas of production readiness. Whether it's SREs, security engineers, everybody who might have a stake in some of these non-functional type requirements, right? You need to create that rubric that is as minimal as possible, but does contain the items that everyone agrees is really critical and is really, really important. And so, yeah, it does require some really ruthless prioritization. This again, this is a good place to include that leadership team that you have buy-in from, in terms of them helping to break ties or forcing prioritization between competing items and helping keep it to like a manageable minimum level. And then finally, once you've got that in place, once you've decided on like what's actually important, you need to actually execute on this service maturity or production readiness work. And to do that, you need to incentivize your teams to do it. So let's talk about different ways to do that. What we found, there are three, well, really, when it comes to incentivizing teams to do this work around production readiness, there's a number of different approaches that will work. And we've seen a number of approaches actually work with our customers. Now, our customers, they vary from really small architectures all the way to really, really big ones with thousands of services and engineers. And I'll talk through these three approaches that have worked well across our customer base. We have a people-based approach I can talk through, which is through like top-down visibility and goals. We have a process-based approach, which is more around like reserving capacity on your dev teams. And I'll talk through a systems-based approach, which involves deep integration with your actual software development lifecycle. These approaches can all work, but they really depend a lot on the type of culture and the type of engineering organization you have at your company. And so they're not one size fits all, and some will work in some places and some will work in other places. As an aside, regardless of the approach that you take, you should really always invest as much as you can in automating as much of the actual work as you can. Make it as easy as possible for engineers to improve their systems and reduce the lift required by dev teams to do all this work. You know what I mean? This always helps. If the ask that you're asking them is small, you're much more likely to get it done. So do invest in automation. But anyway, let's go through these approaches, the people, process, and systems approaches, one by one. So the first option is this people-oriented one. It's something that it just involves a lot of eyeballs, really. With this option, it's important to tie production readiness directly into your existing goal setting cycle, whether it's a quarterly cycle or whatever you might do. And so you can add it directly to your OKRs or whatever you're using as your goal setting mechanism, if you have something like that. If production readiness is something that you measure your teams on and your manager's performance on, and it'll get a lot more, it'll be a lot more top of mind, and you'll directly reward teams and people when they do well on these dimensions. And so another kind of good way of getting eyeballs on things, if you do things like regular operational review style meetings within your organization, we've seen a lot of success by including these failing checks and these underperforming services into these meetings and have it part of that regular review cycle. It's another way of like adding the regular eyeballs. Regardless, it's important if you're approaching it this way to make sure there's constant visibility to engineering leadership on the progress that teams are making on operational maturity. And so that's something that should be like brought back to them regularly through reporting and being able to see that overall roll up. So that's one option. Another option that is a lot more process oriented is to simply carve out regular time where each team is directed to focus on service maturity work. So this can work with a lot more like more autonomous type organizations potentially. It can be done in a number of different ways depending on how you do software development and how your teams function. But for example, if you're working like in a sprint model, Scrum or something for that, for instance, you could carve out time in different ways. One option is to just say, okay, 20% of the points in each of our sprints are going to be carved out. We're going to under kind of allocate what we're doing on the sprint, and 20% of our points will be dedicated to this production readiness work. Or it could be something like, okay, one team member is carved out per sprint to focus on this. It could rotate between team members. Or it could even be, it could be a full sprint, but maybe every fourth or fifth sprint would be something that where you focus on this type of production readiness work. But having that rubric, that production readiness rubric prepared ahead of time, it really makes it so that those hard prioritization decisions are already done. And teams will know then what the next most impactful thing or the next most important change that they should make to their services are, because they'll see that it'll be very clear to them. So that was the second option. A third option, and one that's more systems oriented, is to integrate production readiness directly into your delivery processes. And this is really dependent on on the type of culture that you have and what you already have in place today. But we've seen some organizations be hesitant to roll out processes like continuous deployment, and they've seen that adding some production readiness checks can really give them the confidence to be able to turn on continuous deployment. And specifically, like turn it on those services and on those systems that have proven that they've been able to meet a certain minimum level of maturity. So it helps teams move faster at the end of the day, and it could be a powerful motivator. So like how this, just to make that a little bit more clear how it could work as a quick visualization, here's where you might integrate OpsLevel into your CD pipeline when you're first rolling it out. And again, it really is dependent on your culture and your organization, but this is one way to do it, and we've seen this be successful at our customers in the past as well. So anyway, that's like a third way of integrating production readiness, and it's a very much like a hard way of doing it. But just to recap, or like that kind of covers everything that we discussed today. So to recap, you want to fix your discovery issues by having an automated service catalog, number one. Number two, you want to solve those measurement problems in implementing service maturity with a continuous and an automated and a graduated rubric. And number three, there's this actual problem, this culture of people problem around rolling it out and making it successful. And you want to do that by aligning people, processes, and systems around your rubric. And so that's our presentation today. I'd love to hear any questions, and if there was anybody wants to ask us anything.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ken. I do have one question here that came through that I want to put to you guys. How do we think about defining the individual checks or tests, and in particular, like the thresholds and targets? If we're starting from scratch in my org, how do we build those, those individual checks, and how do we do it the right way?
Sure. Yeah. So there's like two hows. One of them is like, okay, how do we build each of these individual checks? And we didn't get too much into it today, but we have all sorts of checks that can look at the metadata around your services. It could look within your code base, or could integrate with either third-party tools or even your internal tools. We have lots of like custom and API-based checks, and so we're able to actually like get that full picture through various sources. But I think the question is probably more so around like, okay, how do we get started? Like, what should we be looking for, and what should that overall rubric like look like? Now, for that, there is no like one size fits all answer. It really is dependent on what's important for you and for your company. We do have a lot of recommendations that we give, but our overall recommendation though is to start minimal start with a minimal set that the baseline is defined closer to what you do today, and then work on incremental improvements from there. We didn't cover this in in our demo, but we have this concept of campaigns within OpsLevel where you can drive improvements across all of your services and get like adoption of new things. Well, yeah, so what we typically recommend is like starting with what you're doing generally already across your services, and then if you need to like do upgrades or make improvements, work through those on campaigns and drive those out into your rubric, have them graduate into this permanent rubric. Once you're done, getting at least 80% or some big percentage of your services actually compliant with it, whether it's like, a version upgrade, or you're switching to Kubernetes, or you're rolling out like new vulnerability scanners or whatever it is. Don't have all of these requirements piled on teams from the get-go if you're not already doing them across most of your services. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. Awesome. Well, I think that that brings us to the close. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, John and Ken, for sharing some knowledge. Again, we will have the recording out to everyone who's registered, so keep your eyes out for that. And of course, if you have any deeper specific questions about OpsLevel, you can find us at opslevel.com, and we're happy to show you more. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.